A silent deal was signed, not with rifles or tanks, but with tariffs, rare earths, and trade corridors. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump met, and in less than 2 hours, shook the foundations of 43% of global GDP. China agreed to pause rare earth restrictions. The U.S. trimmed tariffs. Analysts call it a truce. But tonight we ask, was it a deal or a masterstroke? Because if this pact holds, the rules of the world economy might just be rewritten. Before we proceed, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your awareness is the first line of defense. This video is for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote conflict. Section 1. The quiet shift. In 2025, the grand stage of global power moved, not through tanks or missiles, but through influence, trade, and timing. This is the year when quiet became the loudest signal of change, and no leader delivered it better than Xi Jinping. Behind closed doors and across conference tables, China executed a strategic pivot that many will only recognize in hindsight. Firstly, Beijing leveraged its dominant position in critical materials. For decades, China processed more than 90% of the world's rare earth elements and magnets, the essential components behind electric vehicles, smartphones, and modern weapons systems. In October 2025, China announced sweeping export licensing requirements, some even extraterritorial, applying to foreign products that contained Chinese origin materials or were built using Chinese technology. But then, a surprise move. Under pressure from emerging trade talks with the U.S., China agreed to delay implementation of those curbs for a year. That pause did not weaken China's hand, it amplified it. By showing restraint, China gained diplomatic legitimacy, avoided economic blowback, and preserved its leverage. At the same time, while headlines told of trade wars and tariffs, China quietly deepened its regional network. On 28 October 2025, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and China signed an upgraded free trade pact, the ACFTA 3.0 version, expanding into digital trade, green technology, and supply chain services. The bloc collectively represents a GDP of about US $3.8 trillion, making it China's largest trading partner. By reinforcing ties with Southeast Asia, China set a parallel economic alignment that bypasses the US-centric trade architecture. Meanwhile, the US-China front exhibited a subtle transformation. Reports from Reuters show that the two powers struck a framework agreement in October that could pause new U.S. tariffs and China's planned export restrictions on rare earths. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the move as averting a major crisis. This quiet detente hasn't been widely portrayed as a victory for Beijing. Yet in reality, China secured its position without firing a shot, by shaping the terms before conflict erupted. What emerges from this quiet shift is a new architecture, China preserving its dominance of critical inputs, deepening regional trade alliances, and negotiating from strength rather than desperation. It did not need to break the system, only reshape it. The world is vast, the rules are complex, and the game has changed. The quiet shift is not mere background noise. It is the signal of a new world order being laid, one where China writes more of the chapters. Section 2. Economic leverage. Rising. China's rise isn't simply about expanding factories or armies. It's about transforming the rules of trade. At the heart of this transformation lies one of the most critical levers of modern economy: rare earth minerals and advanced supply chains. China processes more than 90% of the world's rare earth elements, a stunning concentration of influence. In April 2025, and again in October, Beijing announced sweeping export controls on rare earths, including 8 additional elements and extraterritorial rules that require foreign firms to obtain Chinese licenses if they use Chinese origin materials. The message was clear. China had begun to treat minerals not merely as raw goods, but as geopolitical instruments. Yet in a quiet twist, during trade talks ahead of the Xi Jinping-Donald Trump summit, China agreed to delay enforcement of its latest rare earth export regime for a year, leveraging the threat of disruption rather than immediate shock. In return, Washington suspended new 100% tariff threats and signaled a pause in escalation. This pause isn't weakness, it's strategic. By holding the power of what could be restricted, rather than what is, China amplifies its influence without triggering self-hurt. Meanwhile, China is expanding its economic footprint regionally. On October 28th, China and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, signed an upgraded free trade agreement covering digital trade, green economy, and supply chain services, locking in access to a $3.9 trillion regional economy and reinforcing Beijing as its main trade hub. For many Southeast Asian nations, the choice is no longer simply Western trade versus Chinese trade. It is which ecosystem will dominate. In practical terms, this means Western manufacturers, tech companies, and defense contractors cannot ignore China's role as gatekeeper. From electric vehicle magnets to fighter jet sensors, the materials pipeline runs through Beijing. China's leverage is subtle, often silent, but immensely powerful. It forces competitors and allies alike to ask, can we afford to ignore the rules set by an economy that controls the input chains? In short, China's economic strategy isn't about rapid domination. It's about carefully placing key levers, then letting the world rotate around them. And with each new trade deal, supply chain alignment, and licensing regime, Beijing cements its role not only as the world's factory, but as the world's central system operator. Section 3. Regional dominoes fall as China executes its economic masterstroke. The greatest fallout may come not in boardrooms, but along the coastlines of Southeast Asia. This is where the trade winds turn into strategic currents, and small to mid-sized nations must decide which camp they'll ride. Consider the recently upgraded free trade pact between China and Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Signed in October 2025, this deal spans digital trade, green economy sectors, and supply chain services, and locks China into the region's economic engine. With ASEAN accounting for over US $3.8 trillion in combined GDP, China now positions itself not just as trading partner, but as the indispensable partner. This shift places countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam at a crossroads. On one side sits the US-led security architecture anchored by allied frameworks and defense treaties. On the other side lies China's economic belt, infrastructure build-out, preferential trade, and quick access to markets. For nations struggling with debt, energy shortages, or domestic growth ambitions, the economic carrot moves fast, and fast decision-making is required. For Australia and Japan, both long-standing US security partners, China's economic play doesn't slip under the radar. Beijing isn't just building ports or signing trade deals, it is creating supply chain loops that bypass Western technology and standards. That means for Tokyo and Canberra, adapt or risk being excluded. Meanwhile, smaller ASEAN states watch closely. If Manila, Jakarta, or Kuala Lumpur lean closer to Beijing's orbit, the entire regional balance shifts. Beyond economic ties lies the strategic geometry. China's deeper penetration into Southeast Asia means its military logistics, port access, and surveillance architecture may prime itself for broader use. While the deal may today look peaceful, tomorrow's regional dependencies could translate into leverage. If China gains preferential access to bases or conduits in the region, then the first island chain no longer acts as a buffer. It becomes a pathway. The dominoes are falling. One country shifts trade orientation, the next follows. The collective outcome? A Southeast Asia reshaped by a single economic gravity well, China. The U.S., no longer sole anchor in the region, faces the challenge of adapting its role from default partner to competitive alternative. The quiet economic alignment now becomes strategic regrouping, and one shift at a time. The regional order rotates toward Beijing's axis. Section 4. Washington's reversal. The United States' reaction to China's latest geopolitical maneuver was immediate, yet conflicted. In Busan, President Trump described the meeting as a 12 out of 10, praising China for what he called cooperation and shared goals. Publicly, it was a celebration of diplomacy. Behind closed doors, Washington faced a far more uncomfortable reality. The trade war, the loud, visible clash of tariffs and counter-tariffs, was no longer the primary lever of influence. Dependence, silent and systemic, had become the true vulnerability. Beijing's strategy had exposed a core weakness in American planning. Critical materials and manufacturing capabilities remain heavily reliant on China. The White House responded with ambitious rhetoric, announcing an accelerated push to reform supply chains for rare earths, semiconductors, and other strategic industries. Yet analysts quickly noted that creating an alternative to China's dominance in these sectors is a task that will take years, if not a decade, of investment and coordination. A few new mines, factories, or processing plants cannot instantly replace the integrated ecosystem China has built over decades. Meanwhile, U.S. allies began recalibrating. Japan and Australia ramped up joint military exercises, signaling that regional security would remain a priority even as economic dependencies shifted. The Quad, traditionally a security-focused coalition of 4 nations, began explicitly addressing economic interdependence, supply chain resilience, and technological collaboration. The message was clear: keep military readiness sharp, but diversify economic connections. Washington's approach reflects a nuanced pivot. The trade war, once a blunt instrument, has given way to a subtler but far more consequential strategy of resilience and influence. For American policymakers, Beijing's maneuver poses a systemic dilemma. Should the U.S. prioritize military parity in Asia at the cost of economic leverage, or pursue economic countermeasures aggressively, risking confrontation in multiple arenas? The answer is neither simple nor binary. The balance is delicate, hinging on timing, diplomacy, and innovation. As China quietly reshapes the global economic order, Washington faces a question it cannot ignore. Can it preserve its global influence while navigating an intricate web of interdependence? Failure to act decisively could mean losing the long game, even if short-term headlines suggest temporary victories. Section 5. The global payoff. China's masterstroke is not about dominating a single nation, it's about reordering the architecture of the global economy itself. With the U.S. and China collectively accounting for roughly 43% of global GDP, shifts in their economic and political relationships send shockwaves across every continent. Consider a world in which supply chains increasingly flow through Beijing-controlled hubs, where trade pacts enforce Chinese standards rather than Western norms, and where emerging technologies adhere to frameworks shaped in Shanghai rather than Silicon Valley. In that scenario, China does not merely rise, it leads. For emerging markets and smaller nations, the choice is stark. Align with China to secure access to goods, finance, and technology, or risk marginalization under an increasingly rigid Western-led system. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are already weighing long-term strategic partnerships, balancing investment incentives from Beijing against political and security assurances from Washington. The cost of misalignment is real and measurable. Blocked exports, restricted technology licenses, supply chain disruptions, and fluctuating market access. For multinational corporations, the calculus has changed. Firms now operate in a bifurcated system where regulatory frameworks, cybersecurity standards, and intellectual property rules differ sharply depending on allegiance. Decisions once guided primarily by efficiency must now account for geopolitics, resilience, and compliance. The penalties for missteps are no longer hypothetical. Tariffs, delayed shipments, and even restricted market entry threaten profitability and global operations. The consequences for individuals are equally tangible. Consumers face higher prices, longer wait times for electronics, and slower adoption of advanced technologies. Job markets shift as production relocates to align with strategic priorities, and innovation pipelines adapt to the emerging centers of influence. The deal, however, is far from finished. The question is not whether China's masterstroke will ultimately succeed, but how quickly the global system will adapt, and whether the United States can recalibrate its strategy fast enough to remain a leader rather than a follower. The chessboard is set. Every nation, business, and citizen is now a player. The masterstroke has been placed. The clock is ticking. China's masterstroke is not loud. It is subtle. It is not about conquering land, but about reshaping the rules. The silent deal between Xi and Trump may yet become the turning point in global economic architecture. For millions of companies, nations, and individuals, the fallout will be profound. This is why geopolitics matters. If this insight made you think differently about the world, hit like, leave your sharpest comment, and subscribe to GeoPower Report. Turn on notifications because what happens next will define our economy, our freedoms, our future. Stay vigilant, stay informed,